It all started with an uncomfortable chill. Matthew opened his eyes slowly, his body stiff and head throbbing as he tried to make sense of where he was. He didn't recognize the place. It was a small room with a high window that was impossible to reach and furniture oddly out of place. The wooden floor creaked with every movement, and the air felt heavy, as if time itself had stopped there decades ago. He looked around and saw confused faces, all just as lost as he was. A woman was curled up in one corner, wide-eyed, as if she wanted to disappear. She seemed to be in shock, her lips trembling as she mumbled something to herself that Matthew couldn't quite hear. Next to her was a middle-aged man with a stiff posture and a pale face, glancing around with a completely disoriented look, as if trying to grasp what had happened. There was also a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with thin, trembling hands that showed the fear she was trying to hide. Matthew tried to remember how he had ended up there, but the memory felt slippery, like water running through his fingers. He tried to recall his last conscious moment before waking up in that place, but his mind was a blur. He stood up slowly, leaning against the wall, feeling the cold seep into his hands. He needed to understand what was happening. "Where are we?" the young woman whispered, breaking the heavy silence. No one answered immediately. She looked around, searching for some kind of explanation in the faces of the others, but found only bewildered expressions. Matthew realized that, just like him, everyone there was trying to process the situation, and, like him, couldn't find any answers. The middle-aged man, whose stiff stance reminded Matthew of a soldier, took the initiative to examine the room. He touched the wall, analyzing every detail of the place, as if he expected to find something hidden. Matthew felt a wave of relief. There was something in the man's demeanor that conveyed a sense of security, as if he knew what to do in a crisis. However, his expression showed that he was just as lost as everyone else. "Does anyone remember how they got here?" the man asked in a firm but subdued tone. The others looked at each other, shaking their heads. It seemed that the same haze covered everyone's memories. Matthew felt a pang of frustration and, at the same time, a disturbing sense that something was deeply wrong. The heavy silence was broken by a low, eerie sound that echoed through the room, a barely perceptible noise, like a distant whisper. They exchanged glances, their faces growing paler. The woman huddled in the corner looked even more frightened, her eyes wide as if she had seen something the others couldn't. Matthew approached her slowly, trying to seem as calm as possible. "Are you all right?" he asked, trying to sound reassuring. She turned away, curling up even more. Apparently, she wasn't ready to trust anyone there. Then, as if in response to the silence, a low, raspy voice echoed through the room. It was indistinct, almost imperceptible, but they all heard it clearly. "You have secrets," the voice whispered, as if coming from the walls. Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. Everyone's expressions shifted, the fear evident on each face. The voice continued, slightly louder but still cold and distant, "If you're here, it's because you carry something no one else knows." The words echoed like a verdict, as if that room were a courtroom and they were all being judged. Matthew swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words like a silent accusation. He looked around, seeking some kind of explanation, but found only faces filled with confusion and despair. The young woman looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and uncertainty. She tried to speak, but the words seemed trapped in her throat. This can't be real," she finally said, her voice trembling. Matthew saw she was on the edge of panic. The stiff-postured man tried to calm her down, but his own voice betrayed the uncertainty he felt. He was clearly out of his element, just like everyone there. Matthew, however, felt something different. It was a sense of discomfort that grew by the second. Something inside him whispered that this wasn't just a strange nightmare. There was something more. It was as if he knew these people from somewhere, but he couldn't remember how or why. The feeling was disconcerting, almost unbearable. He knew he had to understand what was going on. A new voice echoed, this time even clearer, with a mocking tone. "You are all here for a reason," declared the voice, with a note of dark amusement. "But don't expect to find a way out before facing what you carry within yourselves." With those words, the room seemed to darken slightly, as if the light itself was fleeing from that place. Matthew pulled back from the wall, his heart racing and mind spinning. He didn't know what it meant, but he had a sense that each person there carried secrets, perhaps terrible ones, that somehow connected them. The young woman and the middle-aged man seemed equally lost, each immersed in their own thoughts, processing the words of the voice. The woman in the corner began mumbling to herself again, repeating something Matthew couldn't quite understand, but that sounded like a desperate prayer. He looked again at the faces around him, trying to find any trace of familiarity, some connection that would explain why they were together there. Yet the more he looked, the more they felt like strangers, people he had never met. And, at the same time, an unsettling feeling that perhaps he did know them somehow lingered in his mind, a forgotten memory fragment threatening to surface. The light grew a little brighter again, but the sense of danger did not fade. On the contrary, it seemed that something was only just beginning. Matthew and the others remained still, immersed in the weight of the words they had heard. The idea of shared secrets among strangers cast a disturbing shadow over each of them, but no one seemed willing to speak. The tension grew in silence, as if everyone were calculating their next move. Matthew, feeling the need to do something, stepped forward and suggested they explore the place. The stiff-postured man nodded, clearly relieved that someone had taken the initiative. They divided into pairs, each heading in a different direction, searching for an exit or some clue. Matthew walked with the young woman, whose pale face still showed traces of fear. He felt a need to protect her, though he wasn't sure from what. His hands shook slightly, and he could feel the weight of his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. The idea that they were trapped, with no explanation or memories, seemed unbearable. As they walked through the hallways, they noticed something strange on the walls. The wallpaper was old, faded, and appeared to subtly change with each step they took. The pattern wasn't consistent, as if each section had been torn off and pasted back on in the wrong way. It was disorienting, and Matthew felt as though he were walking in circles. Despite his attempts to stay calm, he began to realize that the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, leading them to places that shouldn't exist in such a confined space. They approached a door at the end of a hallway, an old door made of dark wood with an oxidized brass handle. Matthew exchanged a look with the young woman before trying to open it. To his surprise, it opened easily, revealing yet another hallway nearly identical to the one they had just walked through. A chill ran down his spine, and he sensed the young woman shrinking beside him, whispering to herself as if trying to calm her own panic. They decided to turn back, but on their way back, they ran into the stiff-postured man and the older woman, who was now walking by his side with a distant, haunted look. The man looked at them with a mixture of relief and deep unease. "Did you find anything?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Matthew shook his head, and the young woman finally spoke, her voice trembling and low. "It's like we're walking in circles, everything seems the same, and there's no way out." The man nodded, taking a deep breath as he looked around. Matthew could tell he was trying to maintain control, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed the growing tension. Suddenly, a low, distant sound echoed through the hallways, like the creaking of a door opening somewhere. They all turned in the direction of the sound, but it faded as quickly as it had started, leaving the silence even heavier. They continued to explore, opening doors that led to other hallways nearly identical to the ones they had already walked through, each shrouded in a disturbing half-light. It seemed that with each door they opened, they returned to the starting point. The claustrophobia intensified, and fear made each step harder. No one spoke much, each person was lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the situation. But with each new hallway or door opened, it became clear that something was keeping them there. After a while, they returned to the original spot where they had first awoken. The silence enveloped the group again, like a thick fog that absorbed all attempts at rationalizing. The older woman, who had remained silent, began muttering something incomprehensible, her eyes fixed on an invisible point ahead. Matthew watched her, concerned about her state, and wondered how long they could endure the pressure of that place without answers. Then, something strange happened. An old portrait hanging on one of the walls caught Matthew's attention. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to be there, looming, as if it had always been part of the setting. The image showed a group of people, possibly from another era, but, to his shock, Matthew had the impression he recognized one of the faces. He moved closer, examining the portrait carefully, and realized that one of the men bore a striking resemblance to the stiff-postured man. He pointed out the portrait to the others, who gathered around, trying to understand what it meant. The stiff-postured man looked back at his hand trembled slightly as he examined the portrait, his eyes wide with fear. The resemblance was undeniable. The idea that this place might be manipulating time or, somehow, connecting them to something deeper started to permeate his thoughts. As they observed the portrait, another low, distant sound echoed. It was a whisper, almost inaudible, but enough to capture everyone's attention. "You're here for a reason," the voice murmured, cold and almost mocking. "This is the place where secrets are revealed, and lies cannot be hidden." The group looked at each other, feeling the weight of those words like a verdict. The young woman took a step back, her eyes wide with horror and doubt. She muttered something about the portrait and secrets, but no one dared to answer. They were all aware that there was something dark in that place, something that wanted to extract their deepest truths. Silence settled over them once more, but now it was filled with a chilling understanding. That prison wasn't just physical. The atmosphere was so thick with silence it felt almost tangible, and the discomfort seemed to grow with each passing second. Matthew still stared at the portrait on the wall, trying to process the resemblance between the man in the picture and their fellow captive. It was as if a layer of reality was peeling back, revealing something darker, something he couldn't fully grasp. He glanced at the others, all visibly shaken, each trying to understand what it could mean. The young woman beside him looked pale, her gaze a mixture of terror and fascination. She turned to the others, her hands tightly clasped together, and mumbled something barely audible. Matthew sensed she wanted to say something important, something that might bring some clarity to their situation, but her words seemed caught, as if she were unable to express her thoughts. He watched her closely, hoping she'd manage to open up. "Don't you all think that," she began, but her sentence trailed off into the uncomfortable silence between them. She looked at Matthew, hesitating, as if searching for an answer he didn't have either. The stiff-postured man seemed increasingly nervous, as though he were struggling against a stubborn memory that insisted on surfacing. He finally broke the silence, his voice lower than before, almost a whisper. "We all were in complicated situations, weren't we?" he asked, his gaze dark and hollow. The young woman nodded, fear plain in her eyes. Matthew nodded briefly as well, remembering that the last night before he woke up in that place was a blur, but something told him that he indeed had something unfinished, something he needed to recall. The older woman, who had been silent until now, raised her face, her eyes glinting with an intensity no one expected. She looked at each of them, as though trying to peer into their souls, before finally speaking. "I remember something," she said, her voice hoarse and frail. "That night everything got confused, I was involved in something terrible." They all looked at her, both curious and uneasy. Matthew felt that somehow, her experiences were linked to the presence of everyone there. He couldn't explain how, but the sense of connection was growing, as if invisible threads tied them together in a knot of secrets. "I do too," the young woman murmured, almost inaudibly. She lowered her gaze, embarrassed, while her hands trembled slightly. That night, something happened, something I could never forget. Matthew and the stiff-postured man exchanged glances, both absorbed in their own memories, still hazy but now intensely present. Matthew felt a wave of anxiety as memories began to emerge, like fragments floating through a thick fog. He remembered an argument, shouting, and a decision that consumed him with guilt, though the details remained elusive. The stiff-postured man, whose expression was becoming more guarded, sighed heavily. He seemed to be wrestling with his conscience, with the weight of something he'd carried for a long time, a secret that seemed to grow like a shadow over him. Finally, he began to speak, his voice so low it nearly disappeared in the oppressive silence. "I, too, carry something," he murmured, averting his gaze, as though he couldn't bear to face the others. "Something I wish I hadn't done." Silence reclaimed the group, each lost in their own memories and regrets. It was as if, little by little, they were unearthing parts of themselves they'd rather keep hidden. Matthew felt a pang of empathy for the others, but at the same time a sense of imminent danger, as though these confessions were a key to something terrifying. A distant sound, like a door opening or an object falling, echoed through the hallway, jolting them from their thoughts. Matthew looked around, feeling his heart race. He had the sense they were being watched, as if something or someone were lurking, ready to act. But at the same time, he realized the sound seemed to come from a specific place, something that might lead them to a new discovery. They decided to follow the direction of the sound, each carrying the weight of the memories that had begun to emerge, forming a dark link between them. As they walked down the hallways, Matthew sensed the place changing slightly with every step. It felt like the environment was responding to their thoughts, as if something beyond their understanding was shaping the prison in response to the memories they shared. They reached a door different from the others, older and more worn, as if it had been there for centuries. The handle looked rusty, but as he touched it, Matthew felt a strange familiarity. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it, and the door opened with a low creak, revealing a dark, empty room with a single object in the center, a wooden table with a set of papers yellowed by time scattered on it. They approached cautiously, examining the papers closely. Matthew picked up one of the documents, his stomach twisting as he read the words scrawled in smeared ink. It was a list of names, dates, and events, many of which felt vaguely familiar. He read it aloud, and the others' faces shifted to a mix of shock and recognition. Each of them found something on that list that seemed to echo their own experiences. This is impossible," the young woman murmured, her voice weak and trembling. She backed away, staring at the papers as though they were cursed. Matthew glanced at the stiff-postured man, who studied the list with an unreadable but deeply fearful expression. They were dealing with something far beyond what they'd imagined, something that connected them in ways they still didn't understand. Each name on that list was a clue to a buried secret, a mystery that had brought them to that place. The group stepped back from the table, feeling the weight of each name, each date, as a reminder of something they'd rather forget. The room felt even heavier, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of the secrets being unearthed. Each of them was lost in their own memories while the echo of the list of names hammered in their minds. Matthew stared at the papers on the table, trying to ignore the growing fear in his chest. The list expanded the meaning of this place, showing that they weren't there by accident. He looked around at the others, each face marked by emotions that ranged from fear to guilt and a deep emptiness, as if they had all lost something inside themselves. The young woman beside him took a step back, terror written plainly across her face. It was as if she were struggling with a memory she didn't want to relive. Matthew felt she was on the verge of a revelation, something that might shed light on their predicament. He moved toward her cautiously, trying to offer some sense of reassurance, but she stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the list. She took a deep breath, and then, in a strained voice, began to speak. That night, I was running away, she whispered, her words carrying a heavy burden. She paused, took another breath, and continued. I was responsible for something terrible, something I could never forget. It felt like everything I did after that night was stained, as if I were trapped in a chain of mistakes with no way out. Matthew felt a pang of sadness as he listened to her. He understood that feeling well, the regret that never disappeared, no matter how hard you tried to bury it. She looked at him, her eyes glistening, as though she were seeking some kind of comfort, but Matthew knew he couldn't give her what she needed. This was a battle each of them would have to face alone. The stiff-postured man, the guardian, watched them all with a serious expression, almost impassive, but Matthew noticed a hint of compassion in his eyes. The guardian wasn't there to judge them, he was just a guide, someone who already knew the weight of choices. Matthew looked away, trying to focus on himself, but he felt the shadows of his past growing more intense, as if they demanded his attention. Then, the older woman lifted her head, her face etched with the weight of years and the guilt she carried. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice broken, as if she were finally allowing herself to feel the weight of it all. I made mistakes too. I made the wrong choices trying to control everything, thinking I knew what was best for others. My arrogance, my presumption, they cost so much. People paid the price for my decisions. I never apologized, never acknowledged the impact of my actions. I thought time would make it go away, but now I see that time doesn't erase the choices we make. They haunt us. Her words echoed in the silence, each sentence carrying a sorrow that the others could feel. Matthew realized that each of them seemed to be reliving a part of themselves they'd rather forget, a part they had tried to bury but was now returning in full force. He looked at the others, feeling that the entire place was somehow connected to what they carried inside. Suddenly, a new voice echoed in the space, a dark whisper that seemed to come from all sides at once. If you're here, it's because you can't escape who you really are. The words sent a collective shiver through them. It was as if the room itself were speaking, as if an unseen presence were watching each of them, waiting for them to confront their worst demons. Matthew tried to speak, but his voice faltered, and he swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He looked at the others, hoping for some form of comfort, but all he saw were terrified faces, weighed down by regret. The young woman beside him started shaking, her eyes fixed on an empty spot as though she were reliving something unbearable. Matthew wanted to help her, but he felt trapped in his own thoughts, in his own failures. The tension among them was almost tangible, and Matthew realized they couldn't ignore what they were facing any longer. Something in this prison wanted them to confront their secrets, their deepest guilts. He glanced at the stiff-postured man, who finally broke the silence, his voice low and filled with sadness. We're here because we need to deal with what we've done, he said, as if finally grasping the purpose of this place. This place, it's a prison for those who can't forgive themselves. And we're trapped, not just here, but inside our own guilt. The understanding began to take root in Matthew, and he saw that the man was right. It was as if the place was designed to pull from them every regret and mistake, to expose their flaws and force them to face what they feared most. He looked around, sensing that each hallway, each door, every shadow in the place was part of a twisted game, a test that would only end when they confronted what kept them captive. The older woman beside him, tears now streaming down her face, looked at Matthew as if searching for some kind of answer. And what if we can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What if we can't forgive ourselves? Her question hung in the air, heavy and challenging, and Matthew realized that this was the crux of their situation. If each of them truly was trapped by their own guilt, they might never find a way out. Maybe this place was an endless cycle, an invisible prison that fed on their regrets, keeping them locked in a nightmare they could never escape. Another wave of despair washed over the group, but Matthew felt something different. A spark of determination started to grow within him. If this place was a reflection of their mistakes, maybe the way out lay in confronting them and finally accepting what they had done. He looked at the others, feeling that he had to lead them, that perhaps their only chance of escape was to face their fears and regrets together. But even with this newfound determination, doubt still lingered. The room was thick with tension as everyone remained immersed in their own thoughts. Matthew felt a lump in his throat, a mix of anxiety and fear, as he looked at the guardian. There was a growing pain in his chest, as if the weight of his own regrets were suffocating him, and he knew that everyone there felt the same. He glanced around, seeing the tense faces of the others, each lost in their own memories. It was as if the past were slowly seeping in, demanding a toll they couldn't ignore. The stiff-postured man finally stepped forward, his gaze serious and filled with the sort of determination Matthew hadn't seen before. He looked around, taking a deep breath as if gathering the courage to speak. "I need to say something," he began, avoiding eye contact, almost as if he were ashamed. I'm not here for the same reasons you are. I was sent here to make sure you face what you've done." His words echoed in the room, leaving everyone in shock. Matthew felt a mixture of anger and rising inside him, while the others seemed equally confused, unable to process what they'd just heard. It was like a deep betrayal had been revealed. The stiff-postured man, the one who had seemed to offer stability and guidance, now confessed to being the guardian of this place. "What do you mean, sent here?" the young woman asked, her voice shaking with indignation. She took a step forward, staring at him as though she wanted to pull the truth out of him. The man lowered his head, his shoulders drooping under the weight of his confession. "I was assigned to watch over this place," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "To observe and ensure that those who need to face their guilt do so in the right way. You're all here because of your choices, your decisions. And I am just a guide, someone who's here to make sure the cycle continues." Matthew felt a surge of anger, but at the same time, an unsettling understanding. It all made sense now, the man's presence, his attitude, the way he always seemed to take the lead. He wasn't a prisoner, he was the guardian, someone sent to make sure they confronted their demons. But there was still something Matthew didn't understand, and he knew he wasn't the only one with questions. "So, you're here to judge us?" the older woman asked, her voice filled with pain and resentment. The man looked at her, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "It's not my role to judge," he replied, his tone mournful. "I'm only here to guide, to help you find your own answers. The truth is, even if I wanted to, I couldn't set you free. Only you have that power." The revelation brought a heavy silence over the group. Each one of them absorbed the truth, trying to process what it meant. Matthew looked around, feeling the urgency of finding a way out, but now he understood that their path depended on more than just a physical escape. There was something within each of them that needed facing, an invisible weight that held them as surely as these walls. The guardian continued, his gaze fixed on the floor as though he were bound by his own dilemmas. "This place, it exists for those who can't deal with their own sins, who refuse to face the truth about who they are," he said, his voice barely audible. "You're not here to be punished by me. You're here to face what you did and, if you're able, to find a way to forgive yourselves." Those words fell over them like a sentence. Matthew felt the truth in what the guardian said, but he also knew how difficult it would be to find forgiveness within himself. He glanced at the young woman beside him, who was still trembling, and reached out to offer some comfort, but she pulled away, unwilling to share that burden. The guardian stepped forward, his gaze intense as he looked at each of them. "This is your time to confront the truth," he said. "Don't run. If you want to get out of here, you need to face what you carry. I can't do this for you, no one can. It's a lonely path, and only you can change what you feel." Matthew knew he was right, but even so, The fear of what he might find inside himself was paralyzing. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on his emotions, and felt a wave of sadness and regret, a mixture of anger and guilt that consumed him. It was like reliving every mistake, every choice he'd rather forget. But at the same time, he sensed that this painful process was the only way to freedom. The older woman beside him began to cry softly, her tears falling silently as she confronted her own demons. The young woman lowered her head, struggling with the memories that resurfaced, and Matthew knew that they were all fighting the same battle, each with their own secrets, their own wounds. The guardian watched them silently, offering neither comfort nor judgment, merely witnessing the inner struggle that each of them was facing. Matthew realized that he wasn't just a guardian, he was a kind of mirror, reflecting the pain and guilt of everyone there, someone who had already been through the same process and was now there to guide them. Time seemed to stretch on as each of them faced their past, delving into the depths of their own emotions. But Matthew sensed that something was changing. It was a subtle feeling, like a small spark of hope beginning to ignite, a possibility that perhaps there was a way out of this prison, a chance to forgive themselves and finally move on. Silence returned to envelop the group as each person wrestled with their own emotions. The pain was almost unbearable, and Matthew felt as though the weight of everything he carried was about to crush him. Yet there was something different in the air, a faint spark of understanding beginning to illuminate the darkness around them. He looked around, seeing the others locked in similar states of painful introspection, but he sensed that something was changing, something that might just set them free. The young woman next to him was the first to break the silence. She was trembling, her gaze fixed on some distant point, as though seeing a memory hidden in the shadows. She took a deep breath and then, in a faint voice, began to speak. I did something terrible, she whispered, her voice heavy with regret. I was in a dark place, emotionally. I made choices I never should have. I hurt people close to me, people who trusted me. And then, I ran, trying to erase what I'd done, but the weight of it never went away. Matthew felt a pang of sorrow as he listened to her words. He knew that feeling all too well, the regret that lingered no matter how hard you tried to bury it. She looked at him, her eyes wet with tears, as though searching for some kind of comfort, but Matthew knew he couldn't give her what she needed. This was a battle each of them would have to face alone. The stiff-postured man, the guardian, watched them all with a serious, almost impassive look, yet Matthew noticed a trace of compassion in his expression. The guardian wasn't there to judge them, he was simply a guide, someone who already understood the weight of choices. Matthew looked away, trying to focus on himself, but he could feel the shadows of his past growing more intense, demanding his attention. Then, the older woman lifted her head, her face marked by the weight of years and the guilt she bore. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice cracked, as though finally allowing herself to feel the weight of it all. I made mistakes too. I was wrong in trying to control everything, thinking I knew what was best for others. My arrogance, my presumption, they cost dearly. People paid the price for my decisions. I never apologized, never acknowledged the impact of my actions. I thought that time would erase it, but now I see that time doesn't erase the choices we make. They follow us. Her words hung in the air, each sentence filled with sorrow the others could feel. Matthew realized that each of them seemed to be reliving parts of themselves they'd rather forget, parts they'd tried to bury but were now coming to the surface with full force. He looked around, feeling that this place was somehow connected to the burdens they carried inside. Suddenly, a dark whisper echoed through the room, coming from everywhere at once, chilling and sinister. If you're here, it's because you can't escape who you really are. The words sent shivers through each of them. It was as if the room itself were speaking, as though an invisible presence were watching each of them, waiting for them to confront their deepest regrets. Matthew tried to speak, but his voice faltered, and he swallowed hard, his heart racing. He looked at the others, hoping for some kind of comfort, but all he saw were faces filled with terror and remorse. The young woman beside him started to shake, her eyes fixed on an empty spot as if reliving something unbearable. Matthew wanted to help her, but he felt trapped in his own thoughts, his own failures. The tension between them was almost tangible, and Matthew realized they couldn't ignore what they were facing any longer. Something in that prison wanted them to confront their secrets, their deepest guilt. He glanced at the stiff-postured man, who finally broke the silence in a low, somber voice. "We're here because we need to face what we've done," he said, as if finally understanding the purpose of this place. "This place, it's a prison for those who can't forgive themselves. And we're trapped, not just physically, but by our own guilt." Matthew began to understand, and he saw that the man was right. It was as if the place was designed to pull out every memory and regret, to expose their flaws and force them to face what they feared most. He looked around, sensing that each corridor, each door, each shadow was part of a twisted game, a test that would only end when they confronted what kept them here. The older woman beside him, tears streaming down her face, looked at Matthew as if seeking some sort of answer. "And what if we can't?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if we're not able to forgive ourselves?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and demanding, and Matthew felt it hit the core of their situation. If each of them truly was held here by their own guilt, maybe they would never find a way out. Perhaps this place was an endless cycle, an invisible prison that fed on their regrets, keeping them trapped in a nightmare they'd never escape. A fresh wave of despair washed over the group, but Matthew felt something different. A spark of determination began to grow within him. If this place was a reflection of their mistakes, maybe the way out was through confronting them and finally accepting what they'd done. He looked at the others, sensing that he might need to lead them, that perhaps their only chance of escape was to face their fears and regrets together. But even with this new determination, doubt still lingered. Silence once again blanketed the group as each of them sank deeper into their own emotions. The pain was almost unbearable, and Matthew felt as if the weight of everything he carried was about to crush him. Yet, there was something different in the air, a small spark of understanding beginning to illuminate the darkness surrounding them. He looked around, seeing the others locked in a similar state of painful introspection, but he sensed that something was changing, something that might finally set them free. The young woman beside him raised her face, her eyes still glistening with tears but now filled with a sense of resolve Matthew hadn't seen before. She looked at him, as if somehow knowing what he was thinking, and gave a small nod, as if they shared the same understanding. "Maybe one of us has to stay," she murmured, her voice low but filled with meaning. "Maybe that's the only way." Matthew's heart sped up as he heard her words. He knew she was right, but he also knew how difficult it would be. If one of them had to stay, someone would have to bear the weight of everyone else's burden, taking on their guilt and regrets so that the others could be free. He looked at the guardian, who was watching their conversation with a mysterious expression, as if he had known this moment would come. "A sacrifice," Matthew said, almost as a whisper. He looked at the others, sensing just how exhausted they were, emotionally drained yet prepared to do whatever was necessary. The space around them seemed to darken, as if the place itself was waiting for their decision. The older woman stepped forward, her face marked with pain and an acceptance of what had to be done. She placed a trembling hand on Matthew's shoulder and looked at him with a sad yet resolute expression. "I can stay," she said, her voice filled with resignation. "I've lived long enough, and maybe I have more to atone for than any of you." Matthew felt his heart ache at her words. He knew that her sacrifice would be an act of courage, but he also felt that it wasn't right. He looked at the young woman and the guardian, searching for a way to prevent it from happening. He didn't want anyone to be left behind, yet he understood that this might be the only path to freedom for the others. The young woman stepped forward, her voice firm as she broke the silence. "I'm willing too," she said, though fear was evident in her eyes. "If someone has to stay, it doesn't matter who. I'll do what's needed." The guardian remained silent, observing the interaction, but Matthew sensed he was waiting for something more, a final decision. Then, in a surge of clarity, Matthew felt it needed to be him. Maybe this was his only chance for redemption. He sensed that he needed to take on the responsibility, to be the sacrifice that would open the way for the others. "I'll stay," Matthew said, his voice soft but determined. He looked at the others, feeling a mixture of sorrow and relief. "If this is the only way to get out of here, then I accept. I'll carry what's needed so you can move on." The guardian raised his gaze, a look of recognition crossing his face. It was as if he had already known that Matthew would make this decision, that his sacrifice was the final step needed to complete the cycle. The young woman and the older woman tried to protest, but Matthew shook his head, indicating that his decision was final. There was a calm in him, an acceptance he hadn't expected to feel, but that now filled his heart. The guardian stepped forward, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder and speaking in a quiet yet respectful tone. "Your sacrifice will not be in vain," he said, his eyes solemn. "You've chosen to face what you carry, and that is true redemption. The path is open now for the others." The room seemed to shift around him, and a door that had been invisible suddenly appeared on the opposite wall. The young woman and the older woman looked at Matthew, their faces etched with sadness but also gratitude. They understood that this would be the last time they'd see him, but they also knew he had found the peace he'd been seeking. Matthew watched as they walked toward the door, giving them a bittersweet smile. He knew he was leaving something behind, but at the same time, he felt he was finally freeing himself. When the door closed behind them, the guardian approached, and Matthew realized he was not alone. Somehow, he knew he had found what he needed, even in that dark and solitary place. The guardian gave him a nod, and the room around them began to fade, dissolving into a peaceful darkness where Matthew could finally release the invisible chains that had bound him. The door closed with a muffled sound, and silence filled the room where Matthew remained, now alone. The weight of his choices seemed to dissolve, replaced by a strange sense of peace. He knew he had done what was necessary, that he had fulfilled the purpose for which he had been brought to this place. He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time, as if he had finally found the redemption he had been searching for. The guardian stood by his side, watching him with an understanding expression. Matthew felt that the guardian knew exactly what was in his heart, as if they shared an invisible connection. The environment around him began to shift, the walls of the room losing shape and dissolving into a deep, calm darkness. The sensation was comforting, as though he were being wrapped in an enduring peace. Matthew closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the silence envelop him. He had accepted what was beyond his control, had finally let go of the regrets that had haunted him for so long. He felt free, even here, in this eternal prison, as if he had found the path to inner peace. He knew that while he was physically trapped, his mind and soul were free to move forward. But as he allowed himself to be embraced by that feeling of tranquility, he noticed a slight movement around him. The darkness surrounding him began to take shape, molding itself into familiar walls and shadows. Gradually, a new environment formed around him, as though the place itself were preparing to receive new occupants. The guardian stepped back, and Matthew suddenly understood that the cycle was only beginning again. The sense of peace was interrupted by a low, distant whisper, unmistakable in its tone. Matthew opened his eyes and saw shadows moving along the walls, indistinct forms drawing nearer. He knew what was happening. New individuals were being brought to the prison, souls who would also have to face their own secrets and regrets. The same journey he had just completed was now to be taken by others, caught in a cycle of remorse and forgiveness. Matthew watched as figures began to materialize in the shadows, each one with an expression of confusion and fear, just as he had been when he arrived. He felt a pang of compassion, knowing they would face their own internal battles, that they would have to confront the secrets that held them captive. He knew the guardian would guide them, as he had guided him, and that the cycle would continue, endlessly. Before he disappeared completely into the darkness, Matthew offered one last silent prayer, hoping that those who came after him would find the peace he had finally achieved.